Hello everyone, it's Mr. Nobody. Today I want to show you a book. Now, it's funny, there have been so many books written, especially in the last century or so, that there's surely to be far more that's forgotten than there is to be remembered, and that's life for you. But I wanted to show you one book, which I took from my mother's basement. This is called Little Folks of Other Lands, and I just wanted to show this to you because we often have ideas of certain times or places. We don't necessarily go there. We don't necessarily take the time to read what they themselves wrote. I think it's actually rather wonderful, if you can, to actually read the accounts of people of that time. And I love some of the old children's book that my mother had. This particular one, which has absolutely gorgeous illustrations in it, was given to one of my aunts in 1959. I believe it's actually a good bit older than that, but it's actually got a little gift message in here saying, Merry Christmas from Mother and Father. And it was given to one of my aunts, as I said. And Little Folk of Other Lands by Waddy Piper. It's got wonderful illustrations in it. Here's the contents. We have little folks from the land of windmills, little folks of the desert, little folks from the land of the Vikings, little folks from the land of the maple leaf, little folks from the land of the sombrero, little folks from the land of many people. It's China, by the way. Little folks from the far north, little folks of the pueblos, little folks without a country, little folks of the land of the white elephant, little folks from the land of the reindeer, which I believe is the Sami people, and Little Folks of the South Seas. And it's just a fun book. It's something you see, especially among the British. They always had this great interest in other cultures. They love writing about them, they love visiting them, they love learning them, and it's something they got to experience a lot with traveling the seas. This book was written for Americans, for American children in the first half of the 20th century, to just introduce them to the children of the world and the other cultures of the world. And one thing that's sort of neat about this is I was reflecting recently how much the world has changed just since I was a kid. I remember watching travel logs and all sorts of other things as I was a kid. There was greater differences. Even, the spread of chain restaurants was something that hadn't really begun as much. There was some of it. I mean, of course, we had McDonald's and Burger King and those sorts of things, but towns were more different. You didn't get the exact same things in every single town you went to. They had their own unique businesses, their own unique cultures that had developed. Partly losing that and the growth of, to some degree, a monoculture is technology, communications is one of the consequences of it. You do get isolation produces these very interesting and unique little subcultures, and by reducing the distance between places, we do lose a little bit of our distinctness. And one thing that I love about this is the illustrations of the different places, the people, the outfits. Excuse me, and they're really wonderful, and I kind of miss some of that distinctiveness. Some of it has been preserved, some of it has been lost. I mean, it's still a big world. There's still many different places in it, but, you have a decent chance of going places and everybody's wearing the same t-shirts and knows a lot of the same things and has a more similar culture. There's at least less of it than there used to be, even just in the United States, even just in the state in which I live. And sometimes it's nice to look back, and I kind of miss some of that. It's rather wonderful because there are some old documentaries which they've even colorized. There's some wonderful video footage that I saw of the islands that my family came from, Dutch islands in the southern part of the country of the Netherlands. These very isolated islands where to get back to the mainland you have to go all the way back and then work your way back up. And they developed they all wore these Dutch outfits, but you had distinct versions of it and little habits that were unique to each town and unique to each island. Even if they had their Dutch outfits they wore, they had their distinct version of it that was there. And you can see around the year 1900 video of people wearing these outfits that are these very historical outfits. They're still wearing them, and things haven't changed that much there, and I'm going to read you just some of the first story in here, The Little Folks from the Land of Windmills, because it's exactly what you see if you watch those documentaries. And it's also neat because they do these festivals, and they're still doing like jousting tournaments, where you try to get the spear through the ring. And it's so neat because, all these peoples have been doing this for hundreds and hundreds of years, and the very things that are described in this story, you can watch videos of this, you can see videos of this. There's also some old videos showing some of the bigger cities like Amsterdam, and of course those have, changed more, and Industrial Revolution has affected them more, but it hadn't yet reached these smaller towns out on the edges. And so it's neat because I like exploring, and it's neat to see these different things. A book that I got my wife that I really enjoyed was this History of Fashion. That was a really fun book. Seeing all these different cultures and the different outfits they had. They're so crazy, and there's so much variety. Anyway, I should actually start reading the book before I bore you to death with all this other talk. To the boys and girls who will read this book, you all want to cross the ocean in a big steamship, I'm sure. Perhaps some of you are looking forward to going by air someday. But there is an easier way to travel than that. It is the book way. Without the trouble of packing even an overnight bag, this book will take you to many faraway and fascinating lands. Waddy Piper hopes it will do more than that. One of the pleasantest things about going to new places is making new friends, isn't it? These little folks from far away whom you will meet in these pages do not wear clothes like yours. They do not eat the same kind of food. But under their skins, you'll find they're not so different from you after all. Surely you can be friends. And now we're off. A pleasant journey. Waddy Piper. And that's something you find if you actually go back and read books, including books like this, from other times. You're like, oh, what lovely people. How similar they are to me. And so I've really enjoyed reading and watching a lot of things from the 50s and from before that. And you can see just from when this is written, there's no internet. You need a book like this to learn things about these other countries. Someone has to have gone there and come back and brought the information, maybe some pictures if you're lucky. And if you're going to visit, you have to go by ship. And it's saying maybe someday by air. That probably wasn't something that was widespread at the time that this book was written. Little Folks from the Land of Windmills. Did you ever hear of a country where the boat skimming along the ocean or higher up than the boys and girls walking in the streets, where the children would have to climb to the second story of their house to be on a level with these boats? It sounds like a make-believe place, but ocean steamers are leaving our ports nearly every day for this country, where the land, in many of its parts, is lower than the sea. The Netherlands, which means lowlands, is one name for this country. Another name is Holland. But I know you want to say, why doesn't the water come in and cover the country all up if the land is so low? It would have long ago if the people had not built high, broad walls called dikes to keep it out. The diagram on the next page shows how this was done. Here we've got a little diagram of dike building here. I remember my grandparents had their wooden shoes in their house, and we, of course, had the little Dutch boy story, children's book about the dike that gets a leak in it, and the little boy has to try and prevent the water from coming in. And as I say, the funny thing is, if you watch the videos and see these outfits, this is what people would have looked like at the time my own family came to America, which I just find very amusing. For many, many years, the Dutch people have been playing a kind of game with the ocean to see which should have the land. This is the way it began. They took a little piece of swampy land and built walls round it. Then they built windmills to pump up the water into canals. The canals carried the water away to the ocean. Then they built ditches to drain off more water. By and by, their piece of land was dry enough to hold houses. Then they did the same thing to another piece of land. They kept on doing this until they had enough land to make one of the finest little countries in Europe. To be sure, it's a very small country, only as large as our own state of Maryland. It has over 7.5 million inhabitants, about 5 times as many people as Maryland. But to make even so small a country meant a great deal of patient work. It is work that has to be kept up, for the ocean is always trying to get into this tiny green land that the Dutch took away from it. Especially in winter, the ocean lashes its waves against the walls and tries to tear holes in them. And during World War II, in one of the cities that my ancestors were from, which is the westernmost part of the Netherlands, they actually deliberately blew a hole in the dike when the Allies were invading to flood the city, to dislodge the Nazis that had fortified it so they could make a landing and begin retaking it. Anyway, the Hollanders keep a guard on the dikes day and night. If the ocean forces its way in, they ring an alarm. Then everybody comes to help mend the dike. The people of Holland have had to build a great many of these dikes. If they were all placed together and set down in our own United States, you might go from Boston away across the country into Nebraska on their tops. You might ride in an automobile, for they are wide enough for 2 cars to pass. In Holland, the dikes are often the favorite strolling place for the people. Let us pretend that we are walking along in the midst of the crowd, all dressed up in their holiday best. What a clatter they make with their wooden shoes on the stone paving of the dike. And here's the illustration. People with their wooden shoes, the fish. I love these little outfits. I feel like there were pictures of... I feel like I once saw a picture of one of my family members dressed like this little boy, probably for some formal occasion. But of course, in America, all that my grandparents had were a pair of shoes left sitting on their fireplace. They are strong, healthy-looking people, but what strange clothes! Don't laugh at the baggy trousers, sharp coats, and wide-brimmed caps that the men wear. The women look odd to us, too. Their skirts are so very wide and full, and they wear so many of them. But their caps of dainty muslin and lace are very pretty. You can see the glitter of gold, silver, or brass underneath. Some have ornaments of metal at each side. A Dutch woman is very proud of her undercap or helmet, especially if it is of gold. Often it belonged to her grandmother and great-grandmother before her, and she will give it to her own little girl. Here's a picture of the ladies. And the book is not wrong. Depending on which town you're from, they would have different little ornaments, some that stuck out with like a little square on them, some that had these little gold spring-looking things that came down, if you could afford it. Very neat little things. Fun variety, too. As for the little folks, they look like small editions of their fathers and mothers, for they are dressed just the same. In cities and large towns, you will see many Dutch people in clothes like your own. But in many parts of Holland, the Dutch like to wear the same kind of clothing that their ancestors have been wearing for centuries. And that's what I was talking about, those traditional outfits. And they're rather wonderful to see. It's highly amusing when you see, especially a video, which you can now, of all those people. And I think these illustrations are beautiful. Love those ducks and tulips. Wouldn't it be fun to go home with one of these rosy-cheeked Dutch boys and girls? This blue-eyed, flaxen-haired little girl is called Wilhelmina. And I would just like to point out that my own ancestors who moved here to where I live in America were Wilhelminus and Wilhelmina. So that's another reason I particularly enjoy this book. Her brother's name is Pieter, or Piet for short. Wilhelmina, like many other little Dutch girls, was named for Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands. Queen Wilhelmina ruled Holland with the help of a congress called the States General, which the people choose themselves. Really, you see, the Dutch people have almost as much to say about the running of their country as we do. Queen Wilhelmina lived in the capital city called The Hague. And here's Piet and Wilhelmina and a goat. Our little Wilhelmina's house is built close to a canal. She often goes out on her front steps to watch her father sailing off to carry his butter and cheese to market. Oh, and boy does my family love cheese. There are many, many canals in Holland, 2,000 miles of them, some big and some little. They are to Holland what roads and streets are to us. In the wintertime, the canals freeze over, and then more than ever they are alive. Everybody puts on skates with runners that turn up like a swan's neck, and they go gliding over the long, smooth stretches of ice. Wilhelmina and brother Piet skate to school, and their brother skates to market. Here are your skates. As we near Wilhelmina's home, we look up at the red-tiled roof. A queer, long-legged bird is perched on a nest of sticks on the chimney. It is a stork. The Dutch people are always kind to storks, for they eat the frogs and worms which make holes in the dikes. The Dutch like to think the stork brings good luck. There's your stork. At the doorstep, Wilhelmina stops and takes off her clumsy wooden shoes. No polite Dutch person ever thinks of wearing soiled shoes into the spickness and spanness of a Dutch house. How everything shines and glistens as we step into the long, low room. Even the heavy wooden chairs and tables are washed once a week. The tiled floor is mopped and scrubbed every day. The rows of blue plates on the mantel are never allowed to gather a bit of dust. In fact, so neat a housekeeper is Wilhelmina's mother that every day she washes down the front of a house with a mop on the end of a long pole. And you can see people do that in historical videos too. We do not see any bedrooms in Wilhelmina's house, but she opens a door in the wall and shows us her bed and a closet. It looks very much like a berth in a stateroom, except that it has curtains of bright colors. We notice another odd thing about this Dutch house. Outside each window hangs a narrow mirror at right angles to the wall. By looking in it, we can see the people passing when they are some distance away. Wilhelmina's mother, while she sits knitting, can see her neighbors coming, or watch for the children getting home from school. But we must bid goodbye to Wilhelmina and Piet if you're to see more of their tidy little country. If you could climb into a low-flying airplane, you would have a fine view. Let us pretend that we can. How very flat the country is. There isn't a mountain or even a hill. This flat country looks a little like a great green checkerboard, divided off by its many ditches and canals. In the green fields there are black and white Holstein cows grazing contentedly. The Dutch take very good care of their cows. They give them plenty to eat and keep them in comfortable, clean quarters. Of course, such cows as these give a great deal of good, rich milk. The father saves some of the milk and also sells some to the dairies. The dairies, with the help of machinery, can turn it into butter and cheese much more quickly than the farmer could by hand. The Dutch are famous for their fine cheese. And I have to say, other than certain kinds of cheddar, the Dutch cheeses are my favorite cheeses, like Gouda or Gouda, if you're Dutch, and Edam. There's so many delicious ones. They're wonderful, creamy cheeses, nutty cheeses, sweet cheeses. They're very edible. Those sort of cheeses, you don't really want to do much of anything with them except just eat them straight. But maybe I feel that way because I'm Dutch. And the Dutch are wonderfully agriculturally productive. Even now, there's something like the second largest agricultural exporter in the world, even though this tiny little country, because they've worked so very hard on being able to produce an excess from what they do. And here's a picture of those lovely little cows. I'm sure those windmills will keep them cool. Windmills do not work that way. Good night. That's from Futurama. As you should know, windmills do not blow wind. They receive wind, which turns the machinery inside that pumps water, or you can also build windmills to grind grain and do all sorts of amazing things. They're quite fantastic structures. And if you have a chance, you should look up online because there are still a few functional windmills left in the world, and people can pull out the stops and let the wind turn it, and you can have grain ground by a windmill, which is amazing. The Dutch are very fond of their cheese, but more than half of what they make is loaded on big steamers at the shipping port of Amsterdam and sent to our own and other countries. Everywhere we see windmills, for nearly every farmer has one. The wind that blows so steadily off the ocean whirls their great sails round and round. Some of the windmills are pumping water from the fields, others are grinding wheat. And there we see great fields of gay tulips, their heads nodding in the wind. You can buy big bunches of them in the markets for a few cents, but the bulbs from which they grow are more costly. Sometimes a bulb grower pays a very large price for a particularly rare kind of bulb. The Dutch are as famous for their bulbs as for their cheeses. The growers care far more for the bulbs than for the flowers. And my wife, who lived in Amsterdam, said that she never lived anywhere where there was such wonderful amounts of flowers available so cheaply, all kinds. And the flower markets of the Netherlands are world-renowned. They're fantastic still. And here's your picture of the windmills. Now, as we look down upon the canal, we see men get out on the bank to pull their barges along with ropes. They have to do this with the wind when the wind dies down. Sometimes they have a big dog to help. Dogs are expected to earn their keep in Holland. You can often see them on the banks, harnessed to milk and vegetable carts. There are thousands of little Dutch boys and girls who have no other homes but these barges. They live very happily, nevertheless. Often their father keeps a cow on board, and their mother has pots of growing flowers. When the children are tired of playing on the decks, they can go ashore and romp along the banks of the canal. Don't you think that Holland, though so tiny, is a fine little country? I'm sure you'll want to get better acquainted with it someday, and its sturdy, industrious people. And here's one of your industrial centers, presumably Amsterdam, and barge. And that's all for today. I'm not going to read tons of stories out of this, although I will show you a couple of illustrations. This is about the Arabs, although this is before the discovery of oil, so it's still during the Bedouin days. I particularly love the illustrations from this section. Reminds me of 1001 Arabian Nights tales. Then you get into the Viking sections, covering the Nordic nations. That's great. Interestingly enough, the longest chapter of all is Canada. But I guess Canada is near neighbor of the United States. Mexico, wonderful style. Great use of Southwestern art style. So whoever made this book was putting in some real work and looked at the outfits, the styles, the writing, tried to give you lots of good information, and really tried to make wonderful drawings that bring it alive. It reminds me of the It's a Small World exhibit, probably from a similar time period as the Small World exhibit in Disneyland. So, wonderful book. If you ever get a chance to find it in a used bookstore somewhere, it's pretty fun. There's the bit on the Roma. And, of course, they speculate in here. People think they might be from India, as we know now. The Roma are, in fact, descended from the people of India. Gets over to Siam here. Thailand here. Oh, this is wonderful. This reminds me of the Dolairs stuff. But I believe this is supposed to be the Sami people. Generally, they talk about the Laplanders in here. So, great pictures. And wonderfully written, too. So, it's just great what amazing little treasures you can find hidden away in old books. Wonderful art, wonderful writing. Little treasures like this, try to keep an eye out for stuff like this. If you're trolling around on eBay or looking through old antique stores or bookstores, you never know what you might find. There's some really fun stuff in there, and I've found some story collections for my daughters, and I was like, these are really great. And also, they have a slightly different slant to them and bend to them than the stories that you might get today. Which I think that's part of the advantage of reading stuff from a variety of different time periods. And it's good to have your kids read some books, not just from right now, and not just movies, music, or video from right now, but even if you're just sticking to America, I mean, come on, we got hundreds of years of history here, all kinds of people, all sorts of books, all sorts of music. There's riches to keep you busy for the rest of your life. Just remember to look backwards in time a little bit too, not only side to side. Anyway, that's all. Just wanted to do a little bit of coverage of this fun little book, The Little People of Other Lands. Have a good day. We'll see you next time.